Imanalla taytakuna mamakuna, ñuka mikani Diego Tituaña, pagi chunkumanta kay rimaykunamanta, ñuka rimagrini ñuka kawsaymanta, shinallata ñuka yuyaymanta pagi shungulla. First of all, I would like to apologize. I really wanted to go and stay with all of you there. Unfortunately, due to other responsibilities and activities that I have to cover in my program, I couldn't travel. But I hope in the future we can have another opportunity, and I really, really would like to visit all of you there. Well, I'm going to try to follow a structure that was given to me by the organizer. I'm going to try to take the opportunity to thank the organizer for inviting me. It is such an honor for me to be part of this panel. And thank you so much. I'm just going to try to share a little bit of my experience during the last years and towards some of the declaration and proclamation of the International Year of the International Decade soon. But well, as I said, I'm going to try to first following some of the guidelines that the organizer provide me, and I think that are really important to start saying who I am and what is my currently work. So, well, in my own language, I introduce me myself. My name is Diego Tituaña. I am a Kichwa Otavalo from Ecuador, which means that I am indigenous person from my country. I belong to what I can say, kind of well-known indigenous community around the world. Our ancestor, our brother and sister usually travel around the world to sell handicrafts or to play Andean music. And I'm really proud to belong to that indigenous nation in Ecuador. What is my work? Well, I am part of the diplomat corps of the Ecuadorian Foreign Service. I start my diplomat career in 2012. And after 2 years, I was appointed as a delegate in the permanent mission of Ecuador to the United Nations in New York. And since that moment, I started to engage more with the agenda or with the portfolio of indigenous peoples at the UN level. At this moment, and I am in a leave of absence. I just finished my diplomatic post last July. And immediately after, I started a program. Yale University named it as a World Fellow. And at this moment, I am being part of this program here in US at Yale University. But immediately after, we will have one important event at the UN level, the high-level event to conclude international year. I'm going back to my country and I'm going back to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So that is something that I think is the introduction of who I am and what is my work. The other two questions that they send me, the organizer, is what drives my passion for working with and for indigenous people, and what is important for us as indigenous people to engage in the UN. I'm going to touch these two together. What drives my passion for working with and for the indigenous people? That is, I can say I have an direct answer. I am an indigenous person too. So I really believe that we have a huge responsibility to continue working for the benefit of our communities, for the benefit of our nations in any space that we can be. So that drive me as indigenous person to continue working for benefits for the indigenous people around the world. And then I'm going to address the importance to engage, that indigenous people must engage with the UN. And I'm going to try to divide this in three spectrums. Um, well, I really believe that we need more indigenous diplomats. The UN is an intergovernmental body conformed by member states. So at the end of the day, the ones that take decisions in any aspect are the member states. In that sense, I really believe that is crucial that we must have more indigenous diplomats uh, in these multilateral spaces. I was sadly the only indigenous diplomat from Latin America during the last 5 years, and I believe that is really important that we can have more and more indigenous being part of the diplomat corps in all the countries. Second, I also would like to highlight that it's important too that more indigenous can be part of the secretariat or agencies or different organs at the UN level, or also in the UN mechanisms that have been created for indigenous people. So this is other important space in which, from my view, there must have more participation for indigenous people. And of course, lastly, is also crucial that we can enhance the participation of indigenous people as at this moment is already in place as a part of the civil society engagement with the UN. So I hope that one day in the future we can be in these other different spaces, and with that we can have more impact in advance the agenda of indigenous people in the world. That will be like the two questions. And to ask to respond the other question that I received, I prefer to start with the presentation, and because I'm going to talk a little bit about the International Year of Indigenous Languages, and also a little bit about the International Day. So immediately that I would like to move for that part. Well, the International Year of Indigenous Peoples, the Indigenous Language, sorry. For sure, from I can say this is an example of the resistance and perseverance of indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples were expressing their concern for the disappearing, for the struggles of the what we were suffering, losing our languages from many years. But under the UN system, also this started in 2003, when the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues recommend to implement or to introduce indigenous language in public administration. After that, in many occasions, the Permanent Forum expressed the importance to address this aspect. But because of the time, I know that I don't have too much time. I just going to highlight the two important points, two important momentums in which actually it was recommended by the indigenous experts that it is important to proclaim the International Year of Indigenous Languages. This happened in 2016 in January. We had a meeting at the UN in New York on indigenous language. Many experts from different parts of the world were meeting in that space. And at the end of the meeting, they do two recommendations. They did two recommendations. One was to the proclamation of the International Year of Indigenous Language for 2018. And also in that report, they recommend a proclamation of the International Decade. Those are the two main recommendations. There are many others, but I just wanted to highlight those two recommendations that came up from that meeting in 2016 in January. 3-4 months later, we have a meeting under the UN Permanent Forum sessions. And also as a part of the UN Permanent Forum session, the members of the forum took the recommendation of the meeting, the expert group meeting, and they recommend to proclaim the International Year of Indigenous Language for 2020. That happened in 2016. And as I said at the beginning, the importance that in the future, having more diplomats, indigenous diplomats, having more indigenous at the secretarial level, having more participation of indigenous people in the civil society participation, we can have more impact. So the proclamation of the International Year actually is a result of coordination and cooperation with indigenous peoples and member states. That happened in November of 2016 under the resolution of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. There was an agreement within the member states to proclaim the International Year of Indigenous Language for 2019. The resolution was promoted by Ecuador and Bolivia in light of the recommendation of the Permanent Forum. And we have a huge support coming from member state, part of the group of friends of indigenous people. They support a lot this proposal, and we were having like extensive and intensive discussions until the moment that we have the opportunity to agree and to was possible to proclaim the International Year. This is one of the aspirations of the indigenous people expressed from many years, and it was possible in 2016 in November. Immediately what happened is that the General Assembly formalized the decision, and it was proclaimed the International Year of Indigenous Language. I'm not going to stop on in other aspects, just to highlight the main objective of the International Year, that was to draw the attention to the critical loss of the indigenous language and the urgent needs to preserve, revitalize, and promote the indigenous language, and to take further urgent steps at the national and international levels. That was the main objective, and with that objective, we gave the UNESCO to lead the process for the celebration of the International Year. I understand that I don't have too much time, so I'm not going to stop in the composition of the steering committee. Just to let you know that in order to celebrate to have a successful celebration of the International Year, we established a steering committee, which is composed by member states and indigenous peoples. During the year, we have had many important events around the world, and just would like to highlight some of the major activities. In January 28, we have the launching of the International Year in Paris, and in February it was the launch of the International Year in New York. Importance of the launch of the International Year in New York is that in that occasion, some countries express that one of the main things that have to came up after all the discussion of the year is that we need to proclaim an international decade. And with that objective, many indigenous people, many stakeholders from different spaces were working toward that proclamation. Later that, we also have regional consultation, we have international and regional and national events. And as I said, I am going back to my country after one of these important events, which is going to take place the coming December 17 at the UN in New York. For that moment, we understand that the adoption of the international decade we already approved. So what is next after the international year? We are almost finishing the international year. So one of the things that was really that was underlined by the indigenous peoples and from many stakeholders was that the importance to proclaim the international decade, the International Decade of Indigenous Language. That already happened, following the example of what we did in 2016. Again, during this year, Ecuador and Bolivia introduced the resolution of the rights of indigenous peoples. And in that resolution, it establishes, or there is a paragraph that proclaimed the International Decade of Indigenous Language. That decision is already done. The full committee agreed on that aspect in November 7th. So what we need to wait now is for the formal adoption of the resolution, of this resolution, the second week approximately in December. And after that, we will have this high-level event to close the international year. What says that paragraph that I mentioned? It says that proclaims the period 2022 to 2032 as the International Decade of Indigenous Language, to draw the attention to the critical loss of indigenous language and the urgent needs to preserve, revitalize, and promote the indigenous language, and to take urgent steps at the national and international levels. What is one of the purpose of the proclamation of the decade? Is that give the many multi-stakeholders the opportunity to continue strengthening their activities that some of them started this year. Other improve or were strengthened during this year so that they can have the opportunity to continue developing their actions for a long period. So we are just waiting for that. Immediately after the formal adoption of the General Assembly of this resolution, it will be really important to start working in the preparatory work. That will be 2020 and 2021. And from my view, as a conclusion, the only uh, way that we can have to have a successful celebration now, to finish the international year, but also starting the international decade, is a multi-stakeholder cooperation. If we can have a coordinated cooperation and action around the world, that is the key to achieve the major objectives of the international year, as we did it, but also to continue for having a successful celebration of the international decade of the indigenous languages. So with that, I will finish. I hope I didn't take too much time, and I will be waiting for some question that probably some of you may have, and I will continue connected, listening the other panelists too, and waiting for a further interaction with all of you. Thank you for listening to me. Sorry for not being there, and please come with me to continue working in this aspect. And thank you so much, Emmy, for all your hard work. And I hope we will meet you in New York next probably next month.
Yes, yes, definitely. Thank you, Diego.